Hello, I'm Anawultus, and today I want to talk a little bit about human rights. Now, human rights is a more complicated and difficult subject than the subject of intrinsic value because human rights essentially requires you to go a bit deeper than the concept of intrinsic value and get into questions not only of axiology but also of anthropology. So, but I'm actually going to bypass a lot of these questions because obviously uh, anthropology is going to be very different depending upon your paradigm. For example, a materialist worldview as opposed to a non-materialist worldview is going to have a very different anthropology. It's going to have a very different definition of what a human is, and therefore of what human nature is. So, as much as a lot of people like to imagine that everyone's on the same page on such questions, it is in fact true that there exist very differing in important places opinions on what exactly a human is. So straight off right off of the bat, we can eliminate the potential of agreement in regards to human rights in between materialists and non-materialists. And when I say non-materialists, I'm not talking about anti-materialists. I'm just talking about people that are not necessarily materialists. So, for example, people that believe that there is a soul or that there are spirits, etc., such things, or people that believe in the supernatural, which statistically speaking is actually the majority of people, at least based on the adherence of that people have to various religions. So, in that sense, the idea that there's a consensus on human rights that we can come to without dealing with these foundational disagreements is actually false, or at least false in a fully intellectually honest philosophical sense, because I'm certain that people are willing to come to consensuses without resolving all the issues that are involved, leading to a potentially inconsistent, yet still nevertheless a consensus. Also, on that note, on the idea of resolving these issues, there's also the problem, or I could say the fact, that there is a real world. So somebody has got to be wrong if people have differing opinions. I'm not saying that necessarily somebody has got to be right, although from a personal perspective, let me say that I am sure that there is someone that is right, and I have certainty in the most absolute sense. Now, that being said, the fact that not everybody is right, but the fact that there could be someone that is right, means that whichever view is right, not right in an absolute moral sense, but right in the sense of expressing the truth of reality, is the viewpoint that allows us to determine the truth of whatever these human rights might be. So, going back onto the idea of intrinsic value, because many people like to define human rights as being derived from a sort of intrinsic value, in other words, a value that humans have by their very being, and or by simply being humans without having any external force acting upon them, no external influence, as opposed to uh, extrinsic values, values that are placed upon someone from an external source. And as I mentioned in my discussion of intrinsic value, I would like to point out that intrinsic value can only be tautological in an absolute sense, which means that we have to instead rely upon extrinsic value. So, what is this extrinsic value? Let me first say that when we determine intrinsic value, and we might say that intrinsic value is determined by an origin of something, well, the problem with that question is, what type of origin is it? Because let's say you break apart a rock and you have smaller rocks, but those rocks are the same substance as the rock you broke apart. So in that sense, there is an intrinsic value from the rock that is carried over as a component of the rock to the smaller rock, being itself now a rock. On the other hand, if you have a toy maker and he is making a toy, the toy maker's substance is not what the toy is made of. The toy is made of other substances, but the toy maker places upon that toy a particular value which he has placed upon it. However, the toy maker's value, simply because he made the toy, does not necessarily pertain to the toy permanently. Because what if the toy becomes somebody else's property, at which point the toys might be repurposed and its value will be changed? For example, a book. A book is usually written with information therein with the general purpose that it might be read and understood. However, there's many other things you can do with books. You can burn books, you can use them as doorstops, you can you might be able to recycle them depending on what exact kind of paper the book is made of. There's all sorts of things you can do with books besides reading them. So in that sense, while there may have been a purpose that the originator of the book has placed upon the book, that purpose can be changed based upon the forces that act upon the book. In other words, based upon the authorities that apply extrinsic value to the book. So, what happens then to humans? Well, the answer is human rights only exist insofar as they are given to humans. So, that being said, in order to give a particular right to all humans, you would have to be in charge of all humans. Now, unfortunately, I don't think that most people that purport to determine what exactly all the human rights are have ever been in charge of most humans, or not to mention all humans. So in order to have a right that is universal to all humans, it needs to come from an authority that applies to all humans. Now, that being said, again, the UN doesn't really count as that. Why? Because not every country in the world is part of the UN, and very frequently there are countries that subvert the UN or disagree with the UN's judgment. For example, the United States itself, despite being one of the major powers in the UN and one of the main enforcers of the will of the UN, is also very frequently dissenting with the UN, and in some cases has withdrawn from arbitration, international arbitration. So in other words, the UN certainly does not have the authority to establish any type of universal human rights. Now, that's not to mention the idea that there can be non-universal human rights, as in local human rights. However, when people talk about human rights, they don't usually talk about non-universal human rights. They're generally speaking in universals, as in applying to all humans. So the problem of human rights, therefore, rests upon establishing an authority, and if we do not have a governmental authority or an international or national authority that uh, has a control of all humans, we need to find something else that has a direct impact and import to all humans. And one thing that many people talk about is nature. Now, the problem that I have with nature, as has been expressed in my book, Actionable Justice, is that nature doesn't actually have the qualities of an authority. Why? Because nature does not have a particular mind. In other words, nature not having a mind, or at least in the classical description of nature, nature does not have a will. And if it does not have a will, nature does not have an imperative. And if nature does not have an imperative, there is no imperative for nature to enforce. In other words, because nature cannot decide what is right and cannot enforce what is right, nature itself has no bearing on what is right. So there's another thesis in regards to this, and that is just general opinion. Well, as I mentioned earlier, because there's different groups that have different values, different religious groups, different philosophical groups, different political groups, we end up in a situation where there is no universal consensus on what is right for all humans, at least among humans. So, that being said, while there are areas where most people generally agree, I don't think that agreement is the same as saying that something is right in a cosmic sense, for the same reason that, in essence, Plato presented the Euthyphro dilemma of what if the right and the good and piety is decided by the gods? Well, what if the gods don't agree? Well, what if it's the consensus of the gods? But what if the consensus changes? Does that mean that there's a cosmic good that is one way one time and one way another time? So the answer, therefore, is that rather than being a a good that changes and adapts, in other words, is completely relative, not only relative to authorities, but relative to different points in time and to different opinions and feelings people are having. The alternative to that, as Plato presents it, through the voice of Socrates, is to have an eternal standard. Now, Plato used this idea of the world of forms as an eternal, immutable standard of right. There's a good out there. Alternatively, Christians instead have this idea of an eternal, immutable person that has power. And I think power, even if we don't go the personal route, power is what is important here. And again, we do end up having to go the personal route because there's necessarily a valuation occurring here. Because you cannot have a valuation without a mind, and if there is no valuation, then there's no right. Because you can't say that something is more valuable than something else without a valuation. So, in essence, that means that the only possible source for a universal, unchanging human right would be an omnipotent deity. Now, then the question becomes not, it's not a relief of, oh, now we know where rights can come from and we can simply confirm our rights simply like that, because now you have to ask yourselves, if there is such a deity that does determine what is right and wrong, do the rights that we imagine we have actually correspond to the rights that that deity gives to humans? And looking from a theological perspective, because now it enters a theological question, I would say that at least in terms of what is called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights put out by the UN, I would say no. I think that is very different from what, from my perspective, I understand about theology, and therefore is, in fact, counter to the rights of humans, and therefore, rather than being right, becomes wrong. And by promoting a wrong, it is in fact evil. But anyway, my point here is not going, I'm not going deep into the theology of this. The reason I'm not going deep into the theology is because I'm trying to bring it back to the idea of human rights. So ultimately, my point is that without such a deity, therefore human rights become the province of the powerful rulers of this world. And that means the kings, the emperors, the presidents, prime ministers, etc., who rule the world. They have the ability to decide what the rights are of the humans, at least of the humans that are in their jurisdiction. Now, these rights are not universal unless they manage to acquire a universal control of some kind. So, essentially, my point here is that human rights, as imagined being intrinsic to humans or being derived from nature, are not real. Those do not exist. Those are what I would say, what I would call a legal fiction. In other words, they're things that people make up because they are useful towards the purposes of those people that make these things up. So ultimately, the point is that, going back over the argument, that humans can only have rights from authorities, and those authorities could be any kind of authority. It could be individuals, families, rulers of countries, authorities in the workplace. But for a right to be universal, it must come from a universal authority. And therefore, that is where you can get human rights. But that may not be it even. Okay? I'm going to introduce another concept here. What if the rights that are afforded to all humans are not actually afforded to them specifically because they are human? And if you enter that into the equation, then that means that human rights don't exist at all. But maybe that's a question for another time. If you want me to get deeper into the theological side of things regarding this, as a Christian, I would be happy to do so. If you would like that, please do tell me in the comments below. If you have a disagreement with a particular point I made, please do tell me as well. If there's anything else you'd like to ask, or a video you'd like to suggest, or you would like to enter into contact with me, please also tell me in the comment section below. Thank you all for watching, and I will be seeing you all next time on Wiltos Over and Out.